All
All right.
The train's arriving.
All right, everybody. Welcome. This is the Kubernetes SIG Architecture Conformance sub-project meeting for whatever the date is today, December 3rd, 2019. I think let me pull up the agenda. As far as I know, the only items on the agenda are for Hippie Hacker, so I will let him, unless somebody added something in the last few minutes, I will let him take over.
Thanks, John. I know we're all just recovering from KubeCon and then Thanksgiving in North America. And so there's not a whole lot of changes since then, though our last meeting was about a month ago because we meet every 2 weeks or so. In general, there was some issues in the last meeting, which I would love to see the video for. I would try to take a look this week, and I didn't take a look at, normally I review the video within a week or two before the next meeting, but so if we can find as a to-do item to get the video from last week, that would be great.
It should be, I posted it to the channel. I don't know that I put it in the agenda document. It should be on the
I'll try to capture that and put it in there.
Unless we forgot to record it, which has happened.
We'll try to process. So the meeting, from the last week in writing, I went and picked up our action items. And I know that Timothy St. Clair was particularly interested in, for the KEP, creating a simple sequence diagram to be sure that if we're going to put a blocking PR, block every PR that doesn't meet these requirements, let's make sure it's really clear what the requirements are and that the sequence is easy to follow. I'll go through that in some of the bot KEP status area. One thing I didn't do, and I think it was assigned to me, was document that Sonobuoy isn't a requirement, but a single run is. That was based on there being some leakage on promotion or people getting conformance acceptance that didn't run everything inside of a single run because they did some custom stuff.
Right.
And so we need to be really clear in the conformance guidelines that you may not need to use Sonobuoy, but we do need to do everything inside of a single run. And it may be we need to update the way that our test runner operates to record the parameters to Ginkgo. Because that's kind of what we're really interested in, is did they run our E2E conformance framework test suite with the args that are a requirement for all the tests. So that's the AI last week and updates on those.
I was gonna say, I can take that update unless you were already working on it.
No, thank you. That would be wonderful. Thanks, John.
No problem.
I added is there any other AIs from last week that I may have missed? This last month? All right.
Not that I can think of offhand. I mean, I have an AI to get the next step done on the behavior stuff. I want to have in the next, probably by the next meeting, so in the next 2 weeks, some, a concrete PR that shows all the linkages between the different YAML files and the actual test execution. And in theory, this should obviate the need for, like, it should automatically show that, when a given test run, make it very clear that each different behavior was hit. So that's my goal in the next 2 weeks, is to have that an end-to-end flow for that whole thing working.
I might go and edit AI for next week. If someone wants to take that, type that in, that would be for John. Initial YAML.
Yeah, we have some of the infrastructure merged now, but I need the YAML, and then there'll be some changes to the code that the test metadata is what I'm thinking, instead of sticking it in a separate YAML. And then code that generates the report of which behaviors were hit, essentially.
Okay. We have a PR somewhere, was it from last week, that I think was open, where we generated all of the test data. It's not behavior data, it's from the other side, from tests.
Yep.
And where was that? Seeking consensus, create EDE watch operations. It was definitely in the last meeting. Baseline
I'm
prow.
talking about John Schnacky's one on generating a full name based upon the entire context, or something different?
Yeah, definitive list of. I'll drop this into the chat area for our group chat for the Slack. Sorry, not Slack. This is in Zoom Slack, the Zoom chat. We wanted a definitive list of all tests, which is separate from definitive list of behaviors. And if you look at the bottom of that, I think John, add custom report logic generation, looks like it was merged.
No, so the custom reporter and logic, I just added a discussion point about that. That's in review right now. I think you're on there and Aaron is on there as well.
Yeah.
I see the
Aaron,
meeting.
so
we can talk about that.
Yeah, I'm trying to reproduce it all locally. So, and I'll respond to your. My main concern is this mechanism is what was like being used to gate tests, and I just need to verify that it's still gating tests.
Well, that was my question, was do we want or need it to really do that? It happened to do that in the past. What he's talking about is, so this document generator used to have some logic in it that said, like, don't add anything to this list that says that it's an alpha test or it's a feature test or whatnot. But do we need that to be another gate? I can add that logic back and we can have that work. I want it to like actually air out and blow up if that happens, rather than silently. But in my opinion, like the whole process of test promotion is this human-driven thing of all the PR reviews and whatnot. I feel like if we wanted a test to be promoted, then we would do it. Like the only time I saw it disagree was with a disruptive test. So the logic wouldn't let it be added. But then we just ended up changing the rules and said, well, we do want disruptive tests because we want this test to be added. And then in addition, it doesn't get around what I think is a bigger issue, that a lot of tests may just be mistagged anyways. So I don't see full value in that extra gate anyways. But I wanted to talk about that.
Yeah, that's like a larger discussion point that I don't know if I'm prepared to dig into today. I'm kind of the belief that just because we don't appropriately tag our tests doesn't mean we should throw the baby out with the bathwater. But I just meant like gating in general. If I add a new conformance test somewhere, will this prevent me from merging the PR? Will this make sure that SIG architecture is involved in approving that? I hear you that we seem to have accepted that there's just a whole lot of manual review burden involved. And so maybe we should just stop adding any sort of automated gates, but I did want to make sure there was at least the minimal one that said that, you know, this group of people has to be involved in gating the tests. And then I, again, don't need to block this PR based on it, but I'm trying to understand how this would be used to tie in with the behaviors thing, so that we could say, like, if this test doesn't exercise a pre-approved behavior, it shouldn't be allowed in the list. But this is me like just saying words after not having a couple months of context, so I may be out of line with the group's direction.
Yeah, I think that the stuff John's doing and the behavior stuff they've not really been in sync that much. We talked a little bit, but I think we probably need a.
Because like my hope was there was going to be some sort of like legacy behaviors file to at least represent the current set of behaviors that are exercised via conformance tests.
My thinking is I will take that. Yes, I will actually. My intent is to actually document those, like not even as legacy as a sort of special link, but like actually document them. So, you know, this is a little bit what I was talking about earlier. It's been slow going, but so even though you've been gone for a little while, it's not as much progress as I would have liked to have seen by now.
Right.
But it is getting there piece by piece.
Yes.
And my goal is in the next couple of weeks to have a fully working sort of end-to-end machinery with a handful of behaviors.
Right.
That's my target.
So like I will try to get John's thing approved today, because like I said, I agree, like it's the AST walking code was a little complicated. I did have a rewrite that tried to simplify it a bunch, but if John's thing just like simply lists out the full test names and gets us to the use of a YAML file instead of a text file, I think that's a good start to help us bridge the two.
And is the intent when we decouple the behaviors in the test to have each test annotated with like a behavior ID? Is that the idea?
That's what I'm thinking. So in the CAP, it talks about having a separate file that maps the two, but that's kind of a pain. So I'm thinking that we could add a metadata that just lists the behaviors that this test is intended to test.
Okay. If we do something like that, Aaron had wondered how my PR would connect to that or support it. To speak to that a little bit, there's specifically this little section of code, right? Like after you already know the test name and you found the place in the code and you're looking at the comments. If I don't see a field in those comments that say like behavior ID or whatever, I could throw an error, panic, or do whatever so that it would blow up for anybody or fail in some predictable way. So we could enforce that.
Yeah, my hope was the existing test name, like almost the thing that's in the comments, we could just use that as a behavior ID or something. But it sounds like John's thinking of multiple behaviors for a single test.
Yeah, I mean, in a sort of legacy way, Aaron, you could probably do what you're saying. Some of the tests already cover what I would consider multiple behaviors, but anyway, but as a sort of conversion point, right? You could do sort of what you're saying. I think Hippie's got something to say.
I wanted to comment on the issue 843330, the first link in our shared Zoom chat. That the reason I wanted to go through and get a definitive list of all tests is not to be any gating mechanism, but for a reference point. And you'll note that Aaron pointed out the text field in that last entry should be unique, but it's not. And also for us to be able to identify independently, for example, when we get a little further in the meeting today around the bot, the PR blocking bot for test, when we try to look at a particular test ID or a test to see when it's promoted, by being able to identify which test that is and the metadata around the test, having that information separate from a behavior. So when we talk about the mapping between what behaviors are and what tests are, I'm trying to have this somewhere where we note the full list of tests and the metadata around them separately from any reporting mechanisms or other things. And I think that what we looked for, what I was excited for about John's run, is that using the instead of the test walker, using the EDE framework to combine that walking of the tree with a dry run, so that we have the context of not only the I think it was the fully generated name. It just to simplify it, I think we need a place where we have our full list of tests separate from what we're trying to map it to. And we were doing that with our documentation generation, which is kind of where that PR started. And I think it was on November 1st that John said, let's combine the dry run with the reporter. And that got merged not long ago, less than a month.
No, the dry run and the reporter, all that hasn't been merged. It's just opened there at the bottom. Yeah.
Okay, I for one need to familiarize myself more closely with this because I haven't really reviewed this closely.
It's not meant to replace conformance.txt. It's meant to give us a full list of all the possible current state of tests, ideally minus the tags. Because we have
Right.
this.
I mean, as I recall, there was an issue that.
Replacing conformance.txt though.
Sorry, say that again, John?
It is replacing conformance.txt though as well. I thought we had even talked about that. So I mean, that conformance.txt used to just be like a short name snippet, and now that's changed to the full YAML, which should all be static and serve all the same purposes as the conformance.txt, but just with more information, and generated with a little more comprehensible logic in places.
Conformance.txt is supposed to be limited to conformance tests. And I was trying to, in addition to conformance.txt/YAML, have what is a place for us to even link to, because currently the Kate's conformance repo and the docs folder and a particular release of Kubernetes is how we link to a test. And that's why we were talking about combining the release metadata walker with the runner to generate the YAML. But it definitely, the output's probably the same. We would just filter it to stuff that was tagged conformance.
I got you. Yeah. So to make that distinction clear for everybody, so what the PR that I put up does is it runs the end-to-end tests in a dry run mode so that it iterates over every test and dumps out information, not just the conformance test, but every test. The second process consumes that information to generate the conformance documents and the conformance.yaml, and that's where the filtering down to just the conformance tests happens. But if you're more interested in, like if you're saying to generate a list of all tests, you could use that same output and then do a slightly different post-processing step to just grab, the file name or the just the test name if that's all you want, so on and so forth. So.
We didn't have the context with just the AST walker. You actually had to do a dry run so that you're in the midst of the context at that point to emit the right things in the logger, which is why the work that John did is so critical to gathering all of those pieces we've needed for a while in one spot.
So to get all of the information, the whole tree of the Ginkgo test tree descriptions, you need to actually do a dry run. Is that what you're saying?
Right. Yeah. So there's Bazel targets for all these things. So it's still a very simple process to execute. But what it does is it builds the test binary, then runs that test binary in a dry run. So like you said, you have the call, what Ginkgo calls the component texts, and which are the context, so that even if you had like a variable inside that test name or something, that would have gotten resolved and all the details. So this is, if somebody actually looked at test output, that would be the name of the test listed. And it actually has call sites and the call stack and stuff, which is how the follow-on post-processing knows where to go and get that, those comments and things. Because unfortunately, when in a dry run, you don't have access to the comments. That comment map gets tossed out.
So we still need some AST munching to get it done.
Right, yeah. The AST is just a little more minimal because you have the call stack. And so, like I need to look in this file a few lines above this line and then look at the comment map and parse that. So you don't have to have as many branching things. You don't have to understand all the different types of AST objects and stuff as much as just saying you just want the comment map at or around that section.
Right.
I see.
It is possible to do all that purely via AST. Again, like if your thing does it, I'm fine advancing the state of the world from text to YAML. Because from YAML, I think we can more easily bridge the behaviors together.
Okay, so I had to step away for a moment when the dogs went insane because there's somebody at the door. So I missed a little bit. Are we trying to, Aaron, it sounded like you said you wanted to get this, there was some reason to merge this today. What is the urgency there?
So there's not a lot of urgency,
Okay.
other than I do feel like this is incremental progress. So I'm just trying to be clear that I don't think I'm trying to like revisit or relitigate the state of the world. But if this needs to like hold off because of code freeze or release stuff, I'm
No,
fine with that.
code freeze is passed. I just need to actually, I have not reviewed it in detail either.
Okay.
So,
Well, maybe you want to take a look. From a review perspective, it looks okay. I'm just like playing around with it to make sure it acts as expected.
I see. Okay.
And I'll have to add back in the logic to error or fail in some way when you detect, alpha feature or a feature test or something like that. I can do that. We can always remove that later if we decide, but you're right that it probably shouldn't be in this PR anyways.
Okay.
Okay. Is there anything more on that, or what's the next thing on our agenda here?
Of the workflow, I think, for the bot, but I didn't actually get to the KEP itself. So I'll drop a link to the KEP, and I'll update the KEP status, and right next to it, I'll put the link to the KEP. I tried to address all of the changes we've had thus far. And I'm trying to find out how to give you a quickly rendered view of if you click in the right areas. And yeah, this is the version. There's the PR, and then underneath it, that link is in the Google, what's this called? In the Google Doc, and I'll paste it in the channel as well. That long URL will render it for you. One of the things we changed is we're not going to do a comment, we're going to do a blocking PR. So rather than doing the comment, there was a request not to go through 3 stages or 4 stages, but go ahead and in that 3rd stage and go ahead and block all PRs, hitting KK with it. Under graduation criteria, we removed, so you'll scroll down if you're doing the thing. Yeah. So past our phases, we have 3 things that we need to gate together. The API group, whenever the API group grows from beta to GA. We have a test, or the series of tests that are pointing, they were pointing to beta, they now need to point to GA. And we also have the test has to have a conformance tag being added. This is the interwoven dependencies of, we can either have a fairly complex decision tree of PRs, or develop a workflow and guidance document for people to do all 3 of these in a single PR and make sure that the bot reacts accordingly. After thinking about it for a long time, I think this is a human problem. We can use the bot to enforce it, but we just need to hit the ground and experience the pain a few times of forcing it through the needle, the eye of the needle here, so that it's really clear that GA is safe.
Okay, so let me see. So you're saying that the bot's going to check, going to look for things that are being promoted. It's going to expect in a given PR, if you're moving from beta to GA, that that there's some tests being hit with, there's some conformance tests, and that those promoted conformance, and they're promoted in the same PR.
Yeah.
And that if those are being promoted, the bot's going to actually go back and check the flakiness. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yeah, I think so. At least, because if ideally if we get this other stuff merged too, we have this concept of a test and its ID and its metadata. So if there's a test and conformance has been added, it gets special treatment. That test can ideally only have added the conformance flag and only have changed the target endpoints, the API group, basically.
Okay.
And if it does that and it's non-flaky, then we're like, cool. That's the first check. Your tests do what they said.
Non-flaky is not always easily, I think, machine. I mean, like just because there's a failure doesn't mean that, like, overall, like, we have a stock out, right? Boom, everything fails. Is that, it's not a flaky test?
I don't think that, so I don't think that this PR, like the bot, will fail the whole, like it won't block on that, but we have
Okay.
a block on flaky right now, right? Just gonna add that tag, add that
We,
flag.
yeah. Well, we have a policy on it, and so right now it requires manually going and looking and seeing if it's flaky, and then if you see, you know, if you see all red, you know that it's probably not it, right? It's probably something else. But okay, so as long as if anything that helps, anything that helps shorten the review cycle. So like if you can, even if you just put a link to the test grid,
Yeah.
so people can go back and look at it.
Okay, thanks. And Aaron was feeding back, focusing on the numbers and not the flakiness, and that's fine. We can just remove the flakiness and have links to the test, because we're definitely going to have, here are the new tests, people. Let's go through.
Right. What I'm saying is, it is useful to me to have a link in the bot feedback, or the author has to put it in the PR. But if you can automatically determine it, you know, a link back to the test grid, so that we can just click on it and see the flakiness or whatever, right? And like, it's just, instead of having to go and figure out the regex and go through all the pain.
That's good feedback. Thank you, John and Aaron.
Yes.
Then when we have new GA endpoints that they are also flipping from beta to GA, that's another step. And at the end of our run, and I'm trying to figure out where these things, where our baseline comes from, but we're going to ensure that those were hit by conformance tests, and they won't be conformance tests unless they went through step 1.
That I presume, if we define the number that we want to like block on, the number could be coverage of GA endpoints by conformance tests.
Yep.
And so, for example, if somebody promoted the pod readiness gate feature to GA, you know, the number of endpoints available would increase, but the number of conformance tests hitting that would not. And so the number would go down, and so we would block.
Yeah.
I feel like we've had a number of features still slip through without actually adding conformance tests.
I think that is what Hippie he already has a job to check for that. I mean, this would be
part of the baseline for it, Aaron. But I'm specifically wanting to address something where we are adding the number. So if we back up to what happened, was it a month and a half ago? We allowed someone to accepted them into the conformance program because they ran their tests in a weird way. And if it was John Schnock and I, we went back and looked at all of the test results for everybody that submitted everything to the conformance repo, and the number of tests changed over time. In the same release that people were submitting, they passed them all, so they were 100%, but the tests they ran were different. And so what I'm trying to catch here is specifically the new ones, regardless of the number, in case there's some where the way that they changed the test changed the endpoints that were hit so that the number is the same. We want to make sure that the new tests are actually the list of tests are hit by the.
But Hippie, in the PR job, it's going to be, the reason that happened was because those tests were run by the person submitting it and they ran it incorrectly. In the PR job, in the CI job, you're going to run it with your parameters, so there's no reason to expect.
Not a change in the list, but there could be a change in the test. So imagine a change to the testing framework, or a change that is in the code that affects, and if it's in this one PR, and maybe I'm digging too deep here, we could just say the number is fine. But I was just slightly concerned that we would allow something through that because of the way the code was changed, that the number was the same, but we actually let that. No, maybe you're right.
I don't have a ton of context here, but it sounds like you're trying to solve two different problems. And this to me would be how to simplify CNCF's certification review process. And we can totally do that, but I feel like the scope for this group is how to ensure that we're actually not letting features go to GA without conformance tests being added.
Yeah.
And this job, is it going to, I guess I was assuming, maybe this is the difference. I was assuming this check is only going to be applied in the case of there being a beta to GA change, or there being an addition of a conformance test.
That's right.
Doing it so selectively is very difficult with the infrastructure that we have. The model that I have in my head is something akin to, like, why don't we have a PR job that measures unit test coverage and then like fails if the unit test coverage goes down by some significant amount, right? I would assume it would be the same sort of thing, but for whatever we define API coverage for.
Right. So in that case, I think what Hippie is trying to say is that if this is firing for any arbitrary change, then we actually, it's possible that that some side effect of some change would say, cause all the conformance tests not to run, right? Somebody changes the framework and accidentally puts in skip conformance tests, right? Like all of a sudden there would be a big drop. But I guess his concern is more that it might shift something such that the numbers stay the same, but the what? If the numbers stay the same, but the coverage decreases somehow? What are you trying to, I guess?
Because we have the baseline that we're comparing it against, we have the full list of tests. And so at a minimum, if the number stayed the same, tell me which test, what was the increase in the denominator and what was the decrease in the numerator. Right?
See, this is where I just kind of go back to like the full list of tests that John's new PR will generate. Mm-hmm. I would use something like that on the CNCF certification review side to make sure that the list of tests that results are generated for actually lines up with the list of tests in the Kubernetes repo for the release of Kubernetes, right? And that's again, I feel like that's different than
that is different. That's not exactly what we're talking about. It would still be on this check. I think it's probably overkill. Hippie is what it comes down to.
We'll drop it and use numbers. So that's good feedback there on don't worry about the new GA endpoints. We'll just use the definition of coverage. And that's where 3 comes in. Make sure it doesn't drop overall.
So when promoting something or like moving things to a new endpoint, say you promote something to conformance, right? That would mean the new endpoint is now being tested. The old endpoint is now no longer being tested. So that should give you a net like 0 change in the coverage in theory, right? Like 1 went up, but you have a new endpoint.
You have a new endpoint, so.
Yeah, conformance doesn't, like our numbers are only
the
denominator of stuff in GA, so.
Say that part again.
The denominator that we're looking at for conformance only includes stuff non-alpha, non-beta. So we don't.
Oh, okay.
The fact it moved is not
so for
obvious.
conformance, it will be okay, but the overall number will actually go down. Right?
Yeah.
You've added endpoints and you've not added hit endpoints, but.
I don't know that I've seen things disappear, like move. They get added.
Yeah, and V1 GA will only ever be monotonically increasing. Like once it hits V1, we're not allowed to remove it.
Yep.
But like if you have a test and it's testing a feature that's like in V1 beta 1 or something, and then you add the endpoints for V1 or whatever, the test would test the new endpoints. Sorry, I have a helicopter over me. The test would test the new endpoints, and so the V1 beta 1 endpoints would stick around but no longer be tested, right?
That sounds legit to me, unless somebody really wanted to exercise both endpoints. And from a conformance perspective, I don't care because I'm only obsessed with the V1 endpoints.
Exactly. From a conformance perspective, we still see coverage go up in that case.
Yeah. The only tricky bit that I'm trying to capture with the bot is it has been the flakiness, and it sounds like we're going to have that be a manual check. on whether over the past period, the tests that we're just adding conformance to, we're happy with as far as its promotion. And that's a manual process. I think it's still okay because it's going to be a big PR to review, and it's going to have lots of eyes.
Yeah, typically I prefer conformance test promotion PRs that give me a link, so I have some confidence that I'm looking at a non-flaky test. There's data available to show how flaky a given test is. We collect that all via BigQuery, and thus far I've never seen a conformance test show up in those flakes. But yeah, I would say that's got to be manual for now, and I would look to any of the release team's efforts to deflake tests for help there.
I think that's everything I had for the conformance PR gating. There was a done that happened this morning for the PROW instance managed by the Kateson for Working Group. Cole, we granted Cole admin access to the CNCF GitHub org, and he's done the appropriate connecting bits. And so now we can go through the next steps in in connecting the CNCF Kate's Conformance Working Group work through that. They're sort of conflated a bit. I'm trying to find a way to separate the two, but we do have that part done. And I think identifying the next steps on the, let's see, this is on for our base job. That's our baseline. Trying to understand where that needs to come from. Currently, that's, did I drop a link in here for that? I don't think I did. Baseline. Yeah, it's on baseline job for master. If you scroll down in the GitHub link, and I can drop that into our chat as well, but it's under our baseline audit logs. So can I link to those? No, I can't. But in the cap, it's on the line that I just pasted. I don't think this is the right job. And we either need to have a periodic job that we all agree is the baseline for conformance. I'm leaning toward a kind job.
Yeah, a kind job would be ideal, at least. Yeah.
I would lean to that too, except that I've had conformance tests dinged. I'm thinking of one specific conformance test that was dinged by OpenShift folks because it didn't work well under like heavily loaded clusters. It's unclear to me how we'd be able to simulate that with kind. Kind is like the happiest possible path, especially when it comes to flakiness or lack thereof. So if we're looking at flakiness in the context of conformance, there's a wide variety of cluster configurations that may be used.
Yeah.
Maybe we need something that's less happy path. This used to be a release blocking job. I don't know why it's not anymore, but I'm gonna guess it's because the storage tests maybe keep flaking a lot, and SIG storage hasn't taken sufficient ownership of that. And maybe we want to consider moving those elsewhere and getting this job back to blocking. Because I personally, I want to use a job that the release team thinks is important enough to block the release on.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, I mean, that whole, should this run under a heavily loaded cluster, I think is a debatable thing, right? Is that really appropriate? Like,
There's
it's a separate discussion, but right, like the evaluation of an individual cluster versus the evaluation of a distribution are different things. And any individual cluster may not pass conformance simply due to the way it's configured. And that doesn't mean that it's not capable of, running jobs that are capable of being conformant. So I'm not sure that's a valid argument for saying a test shouldn't be in conformance if it doesn't work well on heavily loaded clusters.
That is valid. I guess what I would throw out there is I know that the 5,000 node tests that we use to sort of vet the scalability SLOs of Kubernetes do run pretty much all the same tests that are in this job at a smaller scale. And I believe the release team does look to see if it's the scalability correctness job. They do look to see if that's green before releasing.
I think it would be actually good to find maybe a few of the jobs that are important and combine their flakiness, because there's two metrics we're looking for out of our upstream job. One is flakiness, and we could pull that in from multiple places. And the other one is the endpoints that are hit. So tying together the testing and the surface area that we covered. And actually, we could do that with multiple upstream jobs as well. But we need to think about both of those metrics separately, I think.
And this is exactly why I'm saying I would err away from flakiness right now as we look to evaluate stuff.
Yeah.
Agreed. We don't need to solve the which jobs today, but it definitely should be something we try to get through by, end of January.
Okay, well, anything else to discuss, folks?
I have our workflow that we've been going through, identifying endpoints, documenting in SIG. I don't necessarily want to go through that in a demo or anything, but I'd love to pair with everybody on the call at some point and walk through that to get their feedback, because we create public tickets based on that to say, here is querying the availability of things that are yet to be covered, making sure in that issue we document how those endpoints are meant to be used, or the behavior, or this identifying and documenting what needs to happen, identifying the right SIG, so we have the right experts to assign to before we write a test, as far as the test writing team. And then without having to go into specifics, just taking small snippets that everybody can understand simply in whatever language is the simplest to express. We've actually found Go to be difficult to find a way to express hitting some of the API endpoints. And so we've had to go find other languages that, funnily enough, like Python in particular, has really good documentation where there's a snippet of code for writing basically a simple test. And I'm wondering if there aren't ways we can't update the way that we use the, it's the generator that takes code and turns it into Swagger. And the Swagger definition itself can actually include code snippets for testing. But Python's culture and the way that they turn Python stuff into documentation brings that all the way through to their endpoints. And then the making sure that before we go through and write the test, valuing this particular ticket and how much of an increase it'll do and what the specific endpoints that we actually ran against the live cluster with API Snoop will give us. So that before we write tests this next time around, everybody gets buy-off, and we can do this really quickly and create a heap of backlog of ready to write tests. And this can be fed by any mechanisms. Right now we're using the queries that I can walk through later, but I don't. Just wanted to just generally tell if there's any feedback to have on the flow that we're using to create this. I'd love some slide modification. If you're interested in it deeper, I'd love to actually walk through and pair through the flow with John and all the Johns and Aaron and Bridget and anyone else that's on the call.
I may have some time to pair with you tomorrow.
Yeah.
Just to get a sense of it.
Is this? I mean, is this similar to what we looked at about 2 weeks ago in San Diego, or?
It is similar, but it's now flowing through much better. I've got at least 4 people internally using this flow, and we're getting to the point, I'm hoping, where we're actually going to crank out one of these per day per person.
Okay, great.
And that will really give us a decent, well-defined, approved backlog by experts with minimal effort, which has been kind of the grooming the backlog has been hard.
Have we, so currently it's still endpoint level though, right? You had at one point done the analysis, like breaking down by field and things like that.
Yeah.
That's not right
And
now
we
in
have
the
that,
database.
and it's all in the identifying target endpoints. It's actually just identifying target API. Like, it doesn't need to be endpoints. All of the data and the way we query it is there. It's just getting agreement and buy-off on the way that we're doing it.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. I wanted to specifically get some context on whether we are still where we're at with paying attention to fields. Part of what I wanted to pair with on Hippie tomorrow was seeing how API Snoop does that. Because I toyed around a little bit with Knative, however you pronounce it. They had something that does field level coverage, but it's not terribly granular. So it picks up all of the fields that are hit by everything. It's because it's implemented as an admission webhook rather than an audit webhook. But it did identify a couple fields I don't think we're hitting.
So on the coverage, well, I mean, Hippie maybe should say, on the coverage side, the audit webhook, I think, can now do that. On the sort of front side of the behavior side, we have a generator to generate behaviors based on all the fields. But
Okay.
it needs a lot of human curation afterwards. So
Okay. Yeah, I'd like to get a little more spun up on how all that stuff is tied together.
I'll be sure that we have the walkthrough of the issue for our target for
Sure.
API. It'll be target API field usage and what was the other one? And endpoints for anyone that wants to walk through that. I think it'd be particularly interesting for John, for anybody on your team that's looking at for how you're generating the coverage, because we have really rich data available because we've already loaded all of the Swagger and into a queryable format that doesn't require programming, but you can explore the ideas really quickly to come through to actionable. Even if it's all staying in where it's written right now, we'll be able to find those pieces of information. John, you paired with me a bit on it. John Schneck. Yeah.
Yeah, we went through and at least you showed me the flow. We didn't quite, I think, apply it to this. You showed me that workflow tool, though, pairing tool.
Awesome. Well, John and Aaron and I will update the flow based on what we do tomorrow and over the course of the next 2 weeks. So we're going to meet again just for Christmas on like the 17th, I'm guessing.
Is that when it would be? Yeah, that sounds.
It's like
fine.
the 3rd plus 14 days, whatever, 16, 17.
Yep, that should be fine for me.
That it's always a day later for me here.
It's my daughter's birthday, but other than that, it's okay.
And I'm going to try to pair with as many people as possible to get this flow going and get as many example tickets in the queue, so that when we get together next time, we can have had people from different SIGs looking at the output of our workflow and have a kind of refining of what next year might look like. But that's all that I have. Thanks for coming together and going over an agenda primarily set by me. It's very useful for me.
Good. All right. Well, all right. Thanks, everybody. Anything else before we go? We just have, we can get back about 8 minutes if nobody has anything else.
Nothing for me.
Okay.
Welcome, Bridget. Thank you for coming. We'll see you in a few weeks.
Thank you. Bye.
Good day, everyone. Bye.
See you all.
That was